Hi everyone. So today we're taking a look at solving by factoring. So solving by factoring is a method of solving quadratic equations by factoring and using the zero product property. So today what we're focusing on is how to solve quadratic equations that are factorable. So it's very similar to just factoring in general. However, when you're solving by factoring, you're using the zero product property to figure out what the actual solutions are. So what the zero product property tells us is that if we have different terms that are being multiplied and set equal to zero, that any one of these terms, if they're equal to zero, that'll satisfy the equation. So these terms are known as our factors. So if we had something like x times x plus 2, those are our two factors. Our result is 0. So what we're going to do is set x equal to 0 and set x plus 2 equal to 0. If either of those are true, then that's going to be a solution to this equation. So what you do then is solve for x, and that'll give you your solution. So here you get x equals 0 or x equals -2. Either of those values of x satisfy the equation. Here you have some steps on how to solve by factoring. The first thing that you have to do is set your equation equal to 0. Anytime you're dealing with a quadratic, especially if it's one that has a quadratic and a linear, like number 1 here, we have to set it equal to 0 or else it's not going to be factorable. Then step 2 is to determine which method of factoring to use. Today we're going to focus on using the greatest common factor or trinomials where the a value is 1. Tomorrow we'll get into using the AC method when the a value is greater than 1. Once the equation is in its factored form, that's when we use the zero product property and then solve for the variable. Okay, let's take a look at the first couple examples. So for our first example, what I notice here is we only have two terms. Your first step is always to look for our greatest common factor, which in this case is x. So I'm going to factor out an x. I'll be left with x minus 8. Once I'm in my factored form, like so, we're going to use the zero product property, set each of these factors equal to 0. Once we set them equal to 0, we want to solve for x. So for our first factor, it's already set equal to 0. We don't have to solve anything, so we get x equals 0. For the second one, we're going to add 8 to both sides. So we get that x is equal to 0. And up here, x is equal to positive 8. Now both of those values would satisfy this quadratic equation, so that's why those are solutions. Now let's take a look at number 2. For number 2, what you notice is that it's not equal to 0. So our first step is to set it equal to 0 by adding 12x on both sides. Then our equation becomes 4x squared plus 12x is equal to 0. Again, we notice, like in number 1, that it's not a trinomial, but there's a GCF of 4x, so we'll factor out a 4x. And we're left with x plus 3. Then we're going to use the zero product property to set 4x equal to 0 and x plus 3 equal to 0. Divide by 4 over here, so you get that x is equal to 0. Subtract 3, so you'll get x is also equal to -3. So we have two solutions. Okay, moving on to number 3. So for number 3, what we notice is we have 3 terms, so it's a trinomial. First thing we're going to do is look for a GCF, which these 3 terms do not have a greatest common factor. So then what we're going to do is use our AC method or grouping. So -56 times 1 is what we're going to put on the bottom. Remember, that's a times c. And then your b value is -1. Remember the trick, it spells back, so the b value goes up top, a times c goes in the bottom. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to the bottom and add to the top. So what two numbers multiply to -56 and add to -1? It's going to be -8 and positive 7. Now remember, the way that grouping works is you're going to keep your first term, keep your last term, and what we're doing is expanding our middle term using the -8 and the positive 7. So we're going to rewrite this as b squared, remember keeping your first term, expanding the middle term as -8b plus 7b. Keep the last term. Now what you should notice is that the negative 8b plus 7b would simplify to negative 1b. We want that to be true because we need this to be equivalent to the original equation. Okay, so from there, we're going to factor by grouping. So group the first two terms, group the last two terms. We're going to factor out the GCF. So between b squared and negative 8b, the GCF is b, left with b minus 8 on the inside. Between 7b and negative 56, 7 is your GCF, left with b minus 8 on the inside of parentheses. What you should notice is that what's inside the parentheses is the same for both. So that means you did it correctly. Your two factors are what's inside the parentheses and the coefficient, so b plus 7. Then using the zero product property, set both of these equal to 0. And then solve for b. So add 8 to both sides here, subtract 7 from both sides here. So you get that b is equal to 8 and negative 7. Okay, moving on to number 4. Now, actually going back to number 3, I solved this by grouping. If you noticed that when your a value is 1, you can jump right down to this step. Feel free to do that. If you'd rather go through all the steps of grouping, you can do that as well. So whichever method you would like to use. Okay, taking a look at number 4, I see I have a trinomial again, and I have a linear term on the right side. So the first thing we have to do is set this equal to 0 by adding 13x to both sides. So my equation's x squared plus 13x plus 40 is equal to 0. Now I like to use the x just to organize myself, but if you want to jump straight to what the two factors are, you can do that as well. So 1 times 40 is 40. 13 is your b value, so we need two numbers that multiply to 40 to add to 13. Those are 8 and 5. So now since I showed you how to go about it by grouping, feel free to do that. I'm going to jump right to what my factors are, which are 8 and 5. So we have x plus 8, x plus 5 is equal to 0. Now this only occurs when the a value is 1. Tomorrow you're going to see when the a value is greater than 1. If that's the case, then you do actually have to go through factoring by grouping. Okay, now we're going to jump into the zero product property. X plus 8 equals 0, x plus 5 equals 0. Solve for x for both, we get that x is equal to negative 8 and negative 5. Okay, moving on to number 5. So with numbers 5 and 6, what you might notice is that the a value is not 1. Although I did tell you that the a value would be 1 for all the ones that we're doing today, we are also looking at when there's a greatest common factor. So if you notice, between 4x squared, 44x, and 120, there's a GCF of 4, so I can divide the entire equation by 4. And I'm left with x squared minus 11x plus 30 is equal to 0. And then we're able to factor like normal. Now tomorrow, what you'll notice when the a value is greater than 1, you aren't going to be able to divide by a common factor, so you'll have to use the AC method. So here I'm going to make my x. I need two numbers that multiply to 30 that add to negative 11. That's going to be negative 5 and negative 6. So I'm going to jump right into my factors, which are x minus 5 and x minus 6. Then using the zero product property, I have x minus 5 equals 0 and x minus 6 equals 0. So I get that x is equal to 5 or 6. All right, number 6 is the last one. Here it's a combination of if there's a GCF and one where you have to set it equal to 0 first. So I'm going to add 64n to both sides. Okay, so I have 8n squared plus 64n plus 120 is equal to 0. Now we have to divide by our greatest common factor, which in this case is going to be 8. So we'll be left with n squared plus 8n plus 120 divided by 8 is 15, equal to 0. Two numbers that multiply by 15 and add to 8 are 5 and 3. So n plus 5 times n plus 3 is equal to 0. So use the zero product property. So n plus 5 is equal to 0. N plus 3 is equal to 0. So we get that n is equal to, subtract 5, negative 5. Subtract 3, negative 3. So negative 5 or negative 3. All right, thank you for tuning in today, guys, to learn about solving by factoring. Please complete the assignment on Google Classroom. The answer key is attached for you. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or need us to check any of your work.